Horror story, The Betrayal of the Heart. I still can't explain what happened that night. I can't even look at the mirror without seeing her face. My wife, the woman I thought I knew, the one I had loved with every fiber of my being, had betrayed me. But the worst part? She wasn't the only one who betrayed me. It all started on an ordinary Friday evening. There was nothing special about the day. Nothing that would have foreshadowed the nightmare that would unravel. I was late from work, nothing new there. But when I entered our house, I could feel it. The air was thick, heavy, like something was wrong. At first, I thought it was just the usual tiredness from a long work week, but it wasn't. I called out to her, but there was no response. The house was eerily quiet. I made my way to the living room, and there she was, sitting on the couch, her eyes wide, staring at something in the corner of the room. The television was off, but she didn't move. "Jenna?" I called softly, concerned by her stillness. She snapped out of it and turned to look at me, but her eyes weren't the same. They were cold, almost empty. She forced a smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, hi, love," she said, her voice flat, too calm. "I didn't hear you come in." That was when I noticed it. A faint, almost imperceptible chill in the air, like a cold breath brushing against my skin. I told myself it was just the draft from the open window, but it didn't sit right with me. The night dragged on, and as I tried to shake off the unease, I noticed more things out of place. Her behavior was off. She was distracted, as though her mind was elsewhere, lost in thoughts I couldn't reach. I tried to brush it off. It's not unusual for people to get preoccupied from time to time, right? But then I heard it. A whisper. A voice that didn't belong. I was in the kitchen, making dinner, when I heard it clearly, as if someone was standing right behind me. A soft, mocking voice, a man's voice, muttering her name. "Jenna. Jenna." It was followed by a low laugh, almost a growl, and a shiver ran down my spine. I turned around, expecting to see someone, anyone. But the room was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. I shook my head, thinking it was my imagination. But I was wrong. Later that night, after dinner, Jenna insisted she was tired and went to bed early. She never did that. She was always up, reading or talking to me about her day. But that night, she went to bed the moment we finished eating. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I lay awake in our bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of the house settling. And then I heard it again. The whisper. This time, closer. So close, in fact, that it sounded like it was coming from just beside my ear. "Jenna, come to me." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the coldness surrounding me again, the same chill that had filled the house earlier. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was something else. I turned to my side, half expecting to see her there, but she wasn't. The bed was empty, and the covers were tangled. Panic seized me, and I scrambled to get out of bed, rushing to the bedroom door. And then I saw her. Jenna was standing in the hallway, just outside the bedroom. She wasn't facing me, her back to me. But there was something wrong with her stance, something unnatural. Her shoulders were hunched, and her head was tilted at an odd angle, like she was listening to something. "Jenna?" I whispered, stepping toward her. She didn't respond. Instead, she stepped further into the hallway, walking in a trance-like state. I called her name again, louder this time, but she didn't seem to hear me. It was as if she were being controlled by something, someone else. I followed her through the dark house, each step feeling heavier than the last. I knew something was terribly wrong, but I couldn't make myself stop. My feet were moving, but my mind was screaming at me to run, to leave. But I couldn't. We came to the living room, the same place where she had been earlier. Only now, the atmosphere was even heavier. The air felt thick with a presence I couldn't see but could definitely feel. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed the shadow in the corner of the room. It was vague at first, but as I stepped closer, I could make out a shape. A figure. A man. He was tall, his face hidden in darkness, but I could feel his eyes on me. And then I heard it, the same voice I had heard earlier, now clear and mocking. "You shouldn't have come here, James." My heart stopped. The voice wasn't just the voice of a man. It was familiar. That's when I saw him, really saw him. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a ghost. The figure was dressed in the same clothes as the man Jenna had been seeing behind my back. I knew it instantly. "James," the figure whispered again, his voice slithering through the air. "I was here long before you." It was him. The man she had been seeing, the one she had been cheating on me with. The one I thought was nothing more than a vague suspicion, now standing in front of me, a dark, hollow figure. Jenna didn't seem to see him. She was still moving forward, her eyes glazed, as if she was drawn to him. She stopped just inches away from the ghost, her hand reaching out. "Jenna, no!" I shouted, but she didn't respond. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, and I could feel something cold wrap around my heart. The ghost's hand reached out to touch hers, and as soon as their fingers met, I heard the sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. A scream. Not from her. From me. I stumbled backward, my legs giving out beneath me. I fell to the floor, struggling to breathe, feeling like my lungs were being crushed by the weight of what was happening. Jenna turned to me, her face now twisted into something unrecognizable. It was her face, but it wasn't. Her eyes were black, like two bottomless pits. Her mouth opened, but it wasn't her voice that came out. "Leave this place, James," the ghost said through her mouth. "You were never meant to be here. You were never meant to have her." I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. Fear paralyzed me as I watched the two of them together. She was no longer my wife. She had become something else, something I couldn't save. And then, just as suddenly as it all began, everything stopped. The figure disappeared into the air, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. Jenna collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, her eyes flickering with confusion, as if waking from a nightmare. "What happened?" she whispered, looking around the room, as if unsure of what she had just experienced. I wanted to scream, to tell her everything, to demand the truth. But I couldn't. The truth was far darker than I could ever have imagined. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the same house. I left. I never returned. And every night, no matter where I am, I hear the whispers. "Jenna, come to me." But it wasn't just her who betrayed me. It was the ghost, too. And now, both of them haunt me. The days after that night blurred into a haze. I tried to return to some form of normalcy, but it was impossible. The house that had once felt like home, became a prison, a place of memories and guilt that clawed at my mind every time I tried to step foot inside. I couldn't understand what had happened, why Jenna had acted the way she did, or why he was there with her. I left her a message the next day, but she never replied. I tried calling, but the phone would ring endlessly until the voicemail kicked in. The silence on the other end was suffocating. It was a week later when I finally saw her again. I couldn't just let her disappear from my life, not after everything we had shared. My curiosity, mixed with a desperate need for closure, drove me to her family's cabin. It was a place she had always talked about as a refuge when things got overwhelming. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon. The woods surrounding the cabin felt oppressive, as though they were closing in on me. As I walked to the front door, I felt that same chilling sensation again. I knocked twice, the sound echoing in the quiet, isolated air. No answer. I knocked again. "Jenna?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "I need to talk to you." The door creaked open, slowly, as though someone had been standing just behind it, waiting. But when it swung wide, there was no one there. I hesitated for a moment, my heart racing, but then I stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was dim, the only light coming from the fading sun outside. Everything seemed in place, too in place. There was no warmth in the room, no sign of life. But something about it felt wrong, like I was being watched. "Jenna?" I called again, but this time, my voice cracked with a sense of dread. And then I heard it. A soft, almost inaudible whisper from the shadows. "James, you shouldn't have come here." My breath caught in my throat. It was him again, the ghost, the man who had haunted my life and my wife's heart. I spun around, searching the room, but there was no figure in sight. Just the dim shadows stretching along the walls. And then, through the darkness, I saw her. Jenna stood in the far corner, facing the wall, her back to me. I walked toward her slowly, every step heavy, as though I were walking through quicksand. "Jenna," I whispered, my voice desperate. "What's happening? Who is he? Why are you doing this?" She didn't move. Her body was rigid, her posture stiff and unnatural, as though she were frozen in place. The chill in the air grew colder with each step I took. When I reached her, I placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Jenna," I said again, more firmly this time. "Please, look at me." At the sound of my voice, she slowly turned, her face pale, her eyes hollow and lifeless. They were the same black pits I had seen before, the same emptiness that haunted me even now. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, her voice low, barely audible. It wasn't her voice. It was the ghost's. Suddenly, the room seemed to grow darker, the air thickening with an oppressive weight. The shadows seemed to stretch further into the corners of the room, as though they were alive, reaching out to pull me in. I took a step back, but Jenna didn't move. She stayed still, her eyes locked onto mine, vacant and cold. "You're not her," I whispered, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "You're not my wife." The room grew colder still, and the air vibrated with an unsettling energy. The whispering began again, this time louder, coming from every direction. It was as though the walls themselves were speaking. Leave her, leave us." The voice was no longer just the ghost's, it was Jenna's too. Her voice and his, twisted together, blending into something unholy. I felt my heart pound in my chest, my body trembling as if the very air around me was alive and pressing in, suffocating me. And then, I saw him. From the corner of my eye, I glimpsed a figure, tall, dark, and looming. His eyes glowed faintly in the dark, his form almost translucent, but still terrifyingly real. He stood just behind Jenna, his hand resting on her shoulder, pulling her toward him. "Don't you see, James?" The figure's voice echoed in the cabin, its tone low and mocking. She's mine now. I've claimed her soul. I tried to move, to break free from the grip of fear that held me in place, but I couldn't. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen by an unseen force. The air in the room was thick with dread, the walls seeming to close in tighter and tighter, trapping me in their dark embrace. "Leave us, James," Jenna's voice, cold and unfamiliar, whispered again. "There's nothing for you here." I wanted to scream, to shake her, to pull her away from the ghost, but I couldn't. It was as if an invisible wall separated us, holding me back. "You can't save her," the ghost growled, stepping closer, his presence growing stronger, suffocating the room with its malice. "She's already mine." I felt a surge of anger, a deep, primal rage boiling inside me. I couldn't let this happen. Not after everything we'd been through. Not after all the love we shared. "No!" I shouted, my voice breaking the silence that had taken over the room. "I won't let you take her." In that moment, something shifted. A flash of light, brighter than the fading sun, filled the room. The temperature plummeted, and I felt as though the very fabric of reality was tearing apart around me. The ghost hissed, retreating into the darkness. But as he did, Jenna let out a scream, her body jerking violently as though something was ripping through her. I reached out to her, my hands trembling, but just before I could touch her, the room exploded into darkness. I woke up on the cabin floor, gasping for air, my heart racing. The room was quiet again, still as death. But I could feel it, the presence was gone. The ghost was gone. Jenna was gone too. I don't know how long I lay there, but when I finally gathered the strength to stand, the house was empty. Silent. It had all been a nightmare. Right? But the cold breath on my neck, the whispering voice, they wouldn't leave me. And deep down, I knew she was still out there, somewhere. But she wasn't the same anymore. I don't know how much time passed before I could stand again. The air was thick, suffocating, and the silence in the cabin pressed down on me like a heavy weight. I stumbled to my feet, disoriented, my body aching as though I had been trapped in a nightmare that stretched on for hours. I wiped the cold sweat from my brow, trying to steady my breath, but the pounding in my chest wouldn't stop. The room seemed unchanged. The shadows clung to the corners, and the faint smell of damp wood and pine hung in the air. But there was something new now. Something I couldn't place, an unnatural stillness that filled every inch of the room. And then, as if my mind wasn't already unraveling, I heard it. A soft rustle behind me. I turned quickly, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was no one there. The room remained empty, save for the familiar furniture, the same walls, and the lingering chill. Yet the sound remained. A faint whisper. Just barely audible. "James." I froze. It wasn't my name. Not in any normal way. It was like the voice was drifting through the walls themselves, stretching the syllables out with an unnatural reverberation, as if it was being spoken from beyond. I moved cautiously, step by step, toward the front door, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. My breath came out in shallow gasps. Something wasn't right. I could feel the presence again, lurking just behind me, waiting, watching. But as I stepped through the door and out onto the porch, something stopped me. The air was different now, as if the night itself had grown heavier. The woods around the cabin had grown unnervingly silent, no chirping insects, no rustling leaves. The very life seemed to have been drained from the forest. And then, I saw it. There, just beyond the tree line, stood Jenna. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but when I blinked, she was still there. standing motionless in the distance, her body framed by the darkness of the woods. Her face was obscured, but I could see the outline of her form, her long hair cascading down her back. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, just on the edge of the trees, stood the ghost. His figure was more solid now, like the darkness had taken on a shape of its own. He towered over her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Jenna didn't move, her body as still as a statue, her eyes locked straight ahead. It was as if she were waiting for me. Waiting for something to happen. "Jenna!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What are you doing? Come back to me!" But she didn't move. She didn't even seem to hear me. The ghost's grip on her tightened slightly, and I felt a cold wave wash over me, as if the air around me had turned to ice. "Jenna, please," I stepped forward, desperation rising within me. But the moment I moved, the ghost turned his head toward me. His eyes glowed, an unnatural blue, like two cold orbs burning through the night. "You shouldn't be here, James," the ghost's voice rumbled, deeper than before. "She is mine." I froze, the words hitting me like a slap across the face. This wasn't just some hallucination. This wasn't just guilt or a twisted dream. This was real. And the reality was worse than anything I had imagined. "Jenna, listen to me!" I cried out, my voice breaking with the intensity of my fear and anger. "You have to fight it. You have to come back to me." But she didn't move. The darkness around her seemed to press in closer, suffocating the space between us. I couldn't reach her, couldn't get any closer without something pulling me back. The ghost laughed, a low, gravelly sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You don't understand, James. She's already gone. There's nothing left for you here." I stumbled back, panic rising in my chest. I knew I couldn't just stand there. I couldn't let this thing take her. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I pushed forward, rushing through the thick underbrush, the cold air biting at my skin as I ran toward her. My heart pounded, each step feeling heavier than the last. I reached the edge of the trees, but before I could get any closer, the ghost turned toward me, his presence becoming overwhelming. The air shifted again, and a gust of wind blew through the trees, howling like a banshee. "You can't save her," the ghost sneered. "She's already bound to me. There's nothing you can do." But then, through the chaos, I saw it. Jenna's eyes flickered. Just for a second, her gaze shifted, slightly, but it was enough. "Jenna!" I shouted one last time, my voice breaking. "Please, come back. You're not alone. I'm here. You don't have to do this." For the briefest of moments, there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She seemed to hesitate. The ghost's grip on her arm tightened, but she didn't move. "Jenna, fight it," I begged. And then, without warning, everything changed. The air around us seemed to ripple, as though the world itself was warping. A sound, a terrible, deafening noise, echoed from the depths of the woods. The ghost snarled, stepping forward with a speed that shouldn't have been possible. "Leave her alone!" I screamed. The force that pushed me back was like a wall, an invisible barrier of energy, and I fell to the ground. My head hit the earth with a sickening thud, and for a moment, everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, the world was different. The woods were silent, too silent. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground beneath me was cold and damp. The ghost was gone. Jenna was gone. But the silence felt like it was swallowing me whole. I stood slowly, my body trembling, trying to make sense of what I had just experienced. But the truth was clear now. The ghost, the betrayal, everything, it wasn't just a manifestation of my grief. It wasn't just the manifestation of her infidelity. It was a curse. A curse that was tied to her, to me, and to the house we once shared. And somewhere, deep in the darkness of the woods, I knew the ghost was still watching. Still waiting. For her. And for me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The world around me felt like it was decaying, falling apart at the edges. The trees, once so full of life, stood like twisted, barren skeletons in the dark. The cabin, the very place I had hoped to find answers, now loomed behind me, dark and empty, its windows like hollow eyes staring into the void. I stood there for what felt like hours, paralyzed, unsure of what to do. The air was thick with something that felt like malice, something ancient. The woods whispered in a language I couldn't understand, like the earth itself was speaking, warning me, begging me to leave. But I couldn't leave. I wouldn't leave. I had to find her. Jenna. The name echoed in my mind like a prayer, a desperate chant I couldn't escape. I could still feel her presence, faint but undeniable, like a shadow hovering just out of reach. I couldn't go back to my life without knowing what had happened. I had to know why she had disappeared into the night, why she had been claimed by something that didn't belong to this world. I took a step forward, my feet crunching through the dead leaves. The path ahead was unclear, but I knew where I needed to go, back to where it had all started. The living room, the place where I had first felt the presence of the ghost. I pushed through the underbrush, the dark forest swallowing me up with every step. The further I went, the more the world around me seemed to close in, the trees pressing in tighter, the air growing heavier. It felt as though I were walking through a dream, or a nightmare, that I couldn't wake up from. When I finally reached the clearing near the cabin, I saw it again. The shadow. It wasn't just a shadow, though. This time, it was solid, standing tall in the center of the clearing, his form flickering in and out of existence. His glowing blue eyes locked onto mine, and I froze, rooted to the spot. The ghost was waiting. Did you really think you could save her, James? His voice was like gravel grinding together, deep and cruel. She belongs to me now. You can't take her from me. She is mine. Her soul is mine. I wanted to shout at him, to charge at him with all the anger and fear I had, but I couldn't move. His presence was suffocating, like the very air was being drained from my lungs. You don't understand, do you? He continued, stepping closer. You think this is about love? You think your feelings matter in this world? You're nothing but a fool. She was always meant for me. No, I gasped, finally able to speak. You don't have her. You can't have her. She's mine. The ghost tilted his head, almost amused. You still don't get it. She chose me, James. She always has. You were never a part of her destiny. You were just a distraction, a momentary weakness. You were never meant to be in her life. You were never meant to be a part of my world. A chill swept through the clearing, the ground beneath me trembling. The trees seemed to bend, their twisted branches reaching toward the ghost like hungry hands. I could feel the weight of the curse he spoke of, pressing down on everything in its path. No! I shouted, my voice trembling with fury and desperation. I will save her. You can't control her. You're just a monster. A shadow. A parasite. You don't belong here. The ghost laughed, a sound that vibrated through the air like nails on a chalkboard. You don't understand, James. I am not just a ghost. I am something older, something deeper than your pathetic understanding of life and death. You think you can stop me, but you've already lost. Suddenly, I felt it. A tug, deep in my chest. A coldness, pulling at my very soul. It was him, the ghost. He was trying to take me too. I gasped, clutching at my chest, as though I could physically hold onto my life. My heart raced, my vision blurring as I fought against the invisible pull. The forest around me seemed to distort, the trees bending and warping into unnatural shapes, as if the very world were collapsing. But then, something unexpected happened. A soft whisper, faint at first, then growing louder, cut through the chaos. James. It was her. Jenna. Her voice pierced through the darkness, reaching me like a lifeline in the storm. I couldn't explain how, but I knew it was her. I knew she was still in there, trapped, fighting against the force that had taken her. Jenna! I cried, pushing through the pain in my chest. Please, don't give in. You're stronger than this. You're stronger than him. The ghost recoiled slightly, as though my words had struck a nerve. His eyes burned brighter, his form flickering with a strange, otherworldly energy. You don't get it, do you? He hissed, his voice sharp with rage. You can't save her, James. She is mine. You can't change what's been done. But Jenna's voice was still there, faint but clear. I'm not lost yet, James. Help me. It was enough. It was everything. I took a deep breath, trying to focus through the overwhelming dread, through the suffocating cold that pressed against me. I knew I had to do something, anything to break the hold this creature had over her. I didn't have the strength or the power to fight him directly. But I had something else, her. I love you, Jenna. I shouted, my voice breaking with raw emotion. I'll never stop fighting for you. You're mine, and I'm not letting go. Not now. Not ever. The ghost roared, a deafening sound that echoed through the woods, shaking the very earth beneath my feet. The air crackled with energy, the tension thick enough to cut through. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The forest fell silent. The oppressive air lifted, leaving only a lingering chill. The ghost's form was gone, evaporating like smoke. Jenna's voice, though faint, was still with me. I'm here, James. I turned toward the sound, my heart racing, my entire body trembling. And there she was. Jenna, standing just a few feet away, her eyes no longer black, but alive, clear. She was shaking, her body weak, but she was standing on her own. Jenna, I whispered, my voice cracking with relief. I thought I lost you. I thought I lost myself, she said softly, her voice hoarse. But you, your love, brought me back. I stepped toward her, my heart swelling with a mixture of joy and disbelief. I reached out for her, pulling her into an embrace, the weight of everything we had endured crashing down on us both. But as I held her, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The woods, though silent now, still felt wrong. The darkness was still there, just beneath the surface. The ghost may have been gone, but I knew, deep down, that its presence lingered. And somehow, I felt the pull of something even darker. We stood there for what felt like hours, wrapped in each other's arms, the forest still and quiet, as if holding its breath. Jenna's body was trembling slightly, but her grip on me was firm, as if she was afraid to let go. I couldn't blame her. I felt the same way. After everything that had happened, the ghost, the betrayal, the terror, we were still standing. And that felt like a miracle. But as I held her, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air was too still, the trees too quiet. The world around us felt like it was waiting for something, holding its breath, just like we were. James, Jenna's voice was shaky, her words barely a whisper against the overwhelming silence. I'm scared. I pulled back slightly to look at her face, searching her eyes for any hint of the woman I had known, the woman I thought I had lost forever. But what I saw there only deepened my fear. Her eyes weren't just filled with fear, there was something else there, something darker. What is it? I asked, my voice tight with anxiety. She shook her head, her expression distant. I don't know, but it feels like he's still here. Like something is watching us, waiting for us. I felt it too, that creeping sense of unease, the chill that had never quite left the air. Something wasn't over. The ghost may have disappeared, but his influence, his curse, still lingered like a shadow over us. I don't think we're safe here, I said, my voice low. We need to leave. We can't stay in this place. Jenna nodded, her face pale but resolute. She took my hand tightly, and together, we began walking away from the clearing, back toward the cabin. But the path felt different now, darker, as though the very ground we walked on was shifting beneath our feet. The trees seemed to loom closer, their twisted branches reaching out as if to grab us, to pull us back into the darkness. The cabin was just ahead, barely visible through the thick fog that had rolled in without warning. The air felt thick with something malevolent, something ancient. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as we neared the door. It felt wrong. We stepped inside cautiously, the creaking floorboards echoing in the silence. The familiar interior of the cabin now felt strange, alien. The walls seemed to pulse with a strange energy, the air heavy with a presence I couldn't explain. The windows were dark, and even the faint light of the moon couldn't cut through the gloom that filled the space. James, do you feel that? Jenna's voice trembled as she stood near the door, her back to me. It's like the house is alive. I nodded, my heart pounding. Yeah, I feel it too. But before I could say anything more, the temperature in the room plummeted. The chill hit me like a wall, freezing the air around us. I looked at Jenna, and her breath was visible in the air, fogging up in front of her face. Jenna, I whispered, my voice laced with dread. We need to get out of here. Now. But as I turned to the door, it slammed shut on its own, with a force that shook the walls. We both jumped, and I rushed to the door, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The latch held fast, as if something on the other side was keeping it closed. Let us out! I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. Please! And that was when I heard it. A low, rumbling laugh. It wasn't Jenna's. It wasn't mine. It was deeper, hollow, like the sound of the earth groaning under the weight of some unseen force. The laughter echoed in the room, filling the space, as if the walls themselves were laughing at us. You can't escape. The voice was so deep, so powerful, it shook me to my core. It wasn't the ghost we had faced before. This was something worse. This was something older. I turned to look at Jenna, but she wasn't the same. Her face was blank, her eyes empty again, like they had been when I first saw her under the ghost's influence. Her body was stiff, her posture rigid. She wasn't moving, not responding. She was like a puppet, strings pulled tight, controlled by something beyond her. Jenna! I cried, rushing to her, my heart thumping in my chest. Fight it! You have to fight it! But she didn't respond. She didn't even seem to hear me. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, stretching toward her, surrounding her like a dark cocoon. The darkness was alive, pulsating, reaching for her, pulling her away from me. "No!" I shouted, stepping forward, but something grabbed my ankle, pulling me down. I fell to the floor with a crash, my body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The laughter grew louder, more insistent, as the shadows closed in on us. I could feel the cold, the weight of it pressing down on me, suffocating me. It was as if the very air was alive, a malevolent force that wanted to swallow us whole. "She is mine," the voice hissed, its tone full of dark satisfaction. "You were never meant to have her. She belongs to me." I struggled against the weight of the shadows that held me down, fighting with everything I had. But it was useless. The shadows were too strong. The darkness too powerful. And then, in the midst of the chaos, something happened. A flicker of light, a tiny spark, appeared in the center of the room. It was faint at first, but it grew brighter, pushing back the darkness, forcing it to retreat. The shadows hissed and recoiled as the light grew stronger, illuminating the room in a soft, almost holy glow. I looked up, and there, standing in the center of the light, was Jenna. She was glowing, her body bathed in an ethereal light that pushed back the darkness. Her eyes were clear again, and she was moving, no longer stiff and controlled. She stepped forward, her voice steady and strong. "You can't have me," Jenna said, her voice a mixture of defiance and strength. "I am not yours. I never was." The voice, the malevolent force, howled in rage, but Jenna didn't flinch. She stood tall, her hands raised toward the shadows, and with one final shout, she sent a wave of light crashing through the room. The darkness screamed, twisted, and evaporated, vanishing into the air as if it had never been there. The room fell silent once more. The oppressive weight that had held us captive was gone. The shadows were no longer looming over us. Jenna collapsed into my arms, her body trembling with exhaustion, but I could feel her warmth again, her heartbeat against mine. "We did it," I whispered, relief flooding through me. But even as I held her, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the darkness wasn't truly gone. It had been driven back, yes, but it was still out there, waiting, lurking in the corners of our lives, like a patient predator. And I knew one thing for certain. The darkness would return. The silence in the cabin stretched on, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was heavy, charged, as if the air itself still carried the residue of the darkness we had just fought off. I could feel the weight of it in every corner of the room, every breath I took. The fear, the uncertainty, it hadn't fully let go of us yet. Jenna lay in my arms, still trembling, her body weak from the strain of whatever power she had just wielded. Her eyes were closed, but I could see the exhaustion written all over her face. And yet, there was something different about her now. Something new. A strength I hadn't seen in her before. "We're okay," I whispered, as much to reassure myself as to comfort her. "It's over. It's finally over." But even as the words left my lips, I knew I was lying. The darkness had been driven back, yes, but it hadn't disappeared. I could feel it, still lurking just beyond the edges of the cabin, waiting for the moment when it would return. Jenna stirred in my arms, her fingers tightening around mine. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a quiet, hollow sadness. "James, I don't know how much longer we can keep running from this. It's not just going to go away." I didn't know what to say. How could I reassure her when the truth was so clear? We were being hunted, and no matter how much we fought, there was always the chance that the darkness would come back stronger than before. "We'll figure it out," I said, though I didn't believe it. "We always do." She closed her eyes, as if trying to shut out the terror that still clung to us. I could feel her body shaking in my arms, and I realized how fragile she was, how fragile we both were. We had faced something far beyond our understanding, something that had nearly torn us apart. And yet, here we were, still standing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were merely biding time. The ghost, the creature that had taken her, had not truly been defeated. I knew it, deep down in my bones. It was watching us, waiting for its chance to strike again. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat, and Jenna stiffened in my arms. We both turned toward the door, but I couldn't move. The air had grown thick again, the chill returning like an old friend. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the house settling, it was something else. Something alive. And then, we heard it. A soft, whispering voice, low and growling, like a distant storm rumbling on the horizon. James. Jenna. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. It was the ghost. The same voice that had tormented us, that had driven us to the edge of madness. But this time, it wasn't just a whisper in the air. It was coming from somewhere closer. Inside the cabin. We both looked at each other, our faces pale with fear. I thought we got rid of him, Jenna whispered, her voice barely audible. I thought so too, I muttered, my body tense with dread. The whisper came again, louder this time, a low growl that made my blood run cold. You can't escape me. The walls of the cabin seemed to groan, and the floor beneath us shifted. The temperature dropped even further, as if the very air had frozen. I could see my breath in the air now, a thin mist hanging between us. Jenna gripped my arm tightly. It's him. He's here. I didn't answer. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. We couldn't fight him like before. We had no weapons, no defenses, and I knew, deep down, that this wasn't just about a ghost anymore. Whatever force had been controlling him, whatever darkness he had been tied to, was far more powerful than we could comprehend. The door creaked open slowly, inch by inch, as though something was pushing it from the other side. I could feel the air grow heavier, thick with the malevolent presence of whatever had come to claim us. No, I whispered, backing away. We can't go through this again. We can't. But before I could finish, the door flew open with an explosive force, slamming against the wall. The shadows spilled in, writhing and twisting like a living entity. They stretched out, reaching for us, hungry, cold, and insatiable. I could barely make out the figure standing in the doorway. It was him. But this time, he wasn't just a shadow. He was solid, his body glowing with an eerie, unnatural light, his face twisted into a grotesque smile that made my stomach churn. You thought you could escape me? The ghost's voice was a low, rumbling growl. I never leave. I was always here, waiting, watching. I felt a surge of panic rise in me, but I couldn't move. The force in the room, the weight of his presence, was suffocating. Jenna pulled me closer, but I could feel her trembling in my arms. We can't beat him, she whispered, her voice breaking. He's too powerful. He's not just a ghost. He's something more. The Shadow Man stepped forward, his eyes glowing like fiery pits. His laugh echoed in the cabin, bouncing off the walls, making my head spin. I am not a ghost, he hissed. I am something far older. Something you were never meant to understand. I tried to steady myself, but the fear was overwhelming. It was impossible to think clearly, to fight back. But then something shifted. A flicker of light caught my eye, something from the corner of the room, a strange shimmer in the air. It was coming from the fireplace. "Jenna, the fire!" I shouted, barely able to form the words through the tightness in my chest. "The fire! We need to use it." She nodded, her eyes wide with realization, and we both ran toward the fireplace. The shadows lashed out at us, but I grabbed a nearby poker, the cold metal heavy in my hands. I swung it at the nearest shadow, and it shrieked, recoiling as the metal touched it. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. "We can't let him get to us." We both scrambled to the fire, grabbing what we could, wood, logs, anything, and threw it onto the flames. The heat surged immediately, but the Shadow Man didn't retreat. He stepped closer, the shadows swirling around him like a cloak. "You can't stop me," he said, his voice filled with dark amusement. "I am eternal. You cannot burn what is already dead." But as he spoke, something strange happened. The fire grew hotter, brighter, almost alive. The flames leaped up higher than I had ever seen them before, wrapping around the Shadow Man's form, burning with an intensity that filled the room with light. The ghost screamed. The sound was deafening, like 1,000 souls in agony, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Time itself seemed to stop. Then, with a violent explosion, the flames erupted, swallowing the Shadow Man whole. His form writhed and screamed as the fire consumed him, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the end. Maybe we could finally be free. But even as the flames died down, the silence returned. And I knew one thing for sure. We were never going to be free. The darkness was always waiting, always lingering. It would return. And we would have to face it again. The silence in the cabin was overwhelming. The flames that had once blazed with such intensity now flickered weakly, their light barely enough to push back the darkness. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I stood there, frozen, watching the last remnants of the Shadow Man burn away into nothingness. His screams still echoed in my mind, the sound of his suffering searing into my soul. But as the fire died, so too did the sense of relief that had begun to form in me. Jenna's hand gripped mine tightly, but even her presence, her warmth, couldn't shake the deep sense of dread that had settled over us both. We did it, right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes were wide, filled with uncertainty. "It's finally over?" I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that after everything, after the terror, the suffering, we had finally defeated it. I wanted to believe we could go back to our lives, to something normal. But deep down, I knew the truth. The darkness was still there. "It's not over," I said, my voice rough, almost hoarse. "I can feel it. Something is still watching us. Waiting." Jenna's expression faltered, but she didn't argue. She didn't deny it. The same fear that had held us both captive from the very beginning lingered in her eyes, as if she, too, could sense the presence that still hung in the air. I turned away from her, walking slowly toward the now smoldering remains of the fire. The room was heavy with the weight of what we had just witnessed. The twisted form of the ghost burned away, but not forgotten. "What if it's not him?" Jenna asked quietly, her voice trembling. What if we're not done yet?" Her words sent a cold chill down my spine. I didn't want to say it. I didn't want to voice the thought that had been creeping into my mind ever since we had burned the ghost away. But I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something else, something far darker, had been behind him. Something had been pulling the strings, something that had been watching us from the shadows all along. I couldn't shake the feeling that the ghost, he had been nothing more than a vessel, a pawn. And whoever or whatever had been controlling him was still out there, still lurking in the depths of the night. Suddenly, a low growl rumbled from the direction of the door. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was the sound of something, or someone, waiting outside, in the darkness. I spun around, my heart racing, my breath coming in short gasps. Jenna had already moved to my side, her eyes wide with fear. We both heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth just beyond the door. "Who is it?" Jenna whispered, her voice shaking. "What do we do?" I didn't know what to say. The air felt suffocating again, as if it were pressing in from all sides. Every creak of the house, every movement outside, seemed amplified, echoing in my ears. My mind raced, trying to think of a way to protect us, a way to stop whatever was coming. I moved slowly toward the door, reaching out to grab the old brass handle. The footsteps outside stopped the moment my hand touched the knob. The silence that followed was unbearable, so thick it felt like it might crush me. The door creaked, and then the doorknob twisted on its own. I pulled back, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't do this. I couldn't face whatever was out there. Not again. But the door didn't open. Instead, a voice, no, not a voice, a whisper, slithered through the cracks in the wood. "I'm coming for you." It was a voice I didn't recognize. It wasn't the ghost, not the one that had haunted us before. This voice was darker, more insidious. It sent a cold shiver down my spine, a sense of absolute dread that rooted me to the floor. "You think you've won?" the voice continued, its tone laced with malice. "You think you can run?" Jenna stepped closer to me, her eyes wide with terror, but I couldn't move. The words, the coldness, the weight of it all, I couldn't shake it. "It's not him," I whispered, though I barely believed it myself. "It's something else. Something worse. You will never be free," the voice whispered again, its voice filling the room like poison. "I will find you. And I will take everything from you." I took a step back, shaking my head, trying to gather my thoughts. My mind screamed at me to run, to do anything to escape. But where could we go? The woods outside were empty, silent. The cabin, this place, was all we had. Suddenly, the voice stopped. The air grew still again, eerily so. There was no sound, no movement. Just the oppressive silence. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the door opened, slowly, quietly, as if it were an invitation. I didn't want to look. But I had to. I forced my eyes to the door, my body shaking as I turned to face it. And standing there, in the doorway, was not a man, not a ghost. It was a figure, dark, cloaked in shadows, its face hidden in the hood, but its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. And there, just behind it, I saw a flicker of movement, another shadow, smaller, but no less menacing. The figure stepped forward into the cabin, its movements smooth, effortless. The air grew heavier still, and I could almost feel the weight of its presence crushing down on us. "We never left," the figure said softly, its voice barely above a whisper. "We've always been here." Jenna gasped, stepping back, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away from those glowing eyes, the unnatural light that seemed to pulse from them. And I realized then, with a cold certainty, that the nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. I couldn't breathe. My chest was tight, my lungs seizing with panic. The figure standing in the doorway seemed to pull the very life out of the room, the air becoming thick with the weight of its presence. Its eyes, those glowing eyes, burned into me, cold and unforgiving, like a predator staring down its prey. Jenna stood beside me, her hand clutching mine so tightly it almost hurt, her entire body trembling with fear. But I couldn't look away from the figure in the doorway. It was as though it had taken control of my senses, drowning me in a suffocating dread that was impossible to escape. The figure didn't speak again, but I could feel its presence pressing in on us, pulling at the edges of reality itself. The shadows in the room seemed to respond to its will, stretching unnaturally, reaching out like fingers, wrapping around us. "We've always been here," the figure's voice echoed in my mind, as though it had invaded my thoughts. "You were never meant to escape." I didn't know what it wanted. I didn't know what it was. But I knew one thing for sure. It was no longer just the ghost we had faced. This thing, this entity, was something older, something more powerful. And we were completely at its mercy. "You're not real," I said, my voice cracking with defiance, even as I could feel my own body shaking in fear. "You're just a shadow, just a trick." The figure's eyes flickered, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something like amusement in them. But the moment was fleeting, and then the figure took a step forward, crossing the threshold into the cabin. "I am not a trick," it said, its voice growing colder. "I am not just a shadow. I am the darkness that you ran from. The darkness you invited into your life." I felt the words crawl under my skin, their meaning seeping into my bones like poison. This wasn't just a ghost. This wasn't just some haunting. This was something far worse. It was the embodiment of everything dark, everything that had tormented us, from the very first moment we encountered the evil that had invaded our lives. Jenna's grip on my hand tightened even more, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "James," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What do we do? How do we stop it?" I didn't have an answer. I had no idea how to fight something like this. How could we? We had burned away the ghost. We had tried to fight it with fire, with everything we had. But this wasn't something that could be defeated with strength or fire. This was the force behind it all. And it wasn't just a force of nature, it was a part of us, a part of our fear, our regrets, our own betrayal. I felt the darkness pressing around us, the shadows creeping toward us, wrapping around our legs like chains. It was suffocating, drowning us in its weight. But then, through the suffocating darkness, I felt something familiar. It was Jenna's warmth, her hand in mine. In that moment, I realized something. We were more than just victims. We had fought the darkness before. We had survived it. And we could do it again. I turned to Jenna, my heart pounding in my chest. "Whatever happens, we fight together," I said, my voice steady now, despite the terror that still clawed at my insides. She nodded, her eyes filled with fear, but also something else, determination. "Together," she whispered. The figure in the doorway was watching us, its eyes glowing brighter now, its presence more powerful than before. It seemed to draw strength from our fear, from our helplessness. But this time, I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. We weren't powerless. I stepped forward, pulling Jenna with me, and we faced the figure together. The shadows recoiled as I moved, as if they could sense the change in us. The figure's eyes narrowed, its lips curling into a sinister smile. "You think you can stop me?" it hissed, its voice a low, guttural growl. "You are nothing." "We are not nothing," I said, my voice firm now, carrying a strength I hadn't known I possessed. "We are everything." With that, I felt the energy shift. The room trembled, the shadows retreating as if they were afraid of us. The figure hissed again, but I didn't flinch. I reached out, pulling Jenna even closer, and together, we stepped forward, our bodies aligned, our hearts beating as one. The figure tried to fight back. It lashed out, shadows swirling violently, but we stood firm. The more we resisted, the more the darkness recoiled. It was as though our unity, our shared strength, was a weapon that the darkness couldn't withstand. No, the figure howled, its voice filled with rage and fear. You can't do this. But we could. We were stronger than it thought. Stronger than the darkness that had haunted us. With a final, determined step forward, we pushed the figure back, the light in the room growing brighter and brighter as we did. The shadows screamed as they were torn apart, disintegrating into nothingness. And then, with one final burst of energy, the figure vanished. The room went silent. We stood there, breathless, in the aftermath of the battle. The air around us was still. The shadows were gone. The darkness had finally retreated. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt peace. Jenna and I were standing in the middle of the room, the destruction of the darkness behind us. We had survived. We had fought together and won. And in that moment, I realized that no matter what darkness came our way, we would face it. Together. We had been tested. We had been torn apart by fear and betrayal, but we had come through it stronger than before. And as the sun began to rise outside, casting its light over the cabin, I knew one thing for certain. We were free. The darkness was gone. For now. And whatever came next, we would face it together. The end. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Horror Echo. Let us know if you've ever had a similar experience. We'd love to hear your story. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.